The Makabirian Empire was a juggernaut, a relentless tide of conquest that had swept across 5 galactic sectors, leaving only submission and ruin in its wake. Their soldiers were engineered for war, their minds a synthesis of cold logic and unyielding discipline, their bodies augmented with biomechanical enhancements that made them faster, stronger, and more lethal than any organic species could hope to match. They were the galaxy's apex predators, an unstoppable force that crushed resistance with calculated efficiency. At least, that's what they believed. When the Makabirians turned their gaze toward humanity's colonies on the Outer Rim, a fledgling species barely known to the wider galaxy, they expected nothing more than another effortless victory. Humanity was primitive by their standards, a race still fumbling with rudimentary technologies and clinging to outdated notions of individuality and chaos. They were soft, fragile creatures who had no hive-mind coordination like the Zorathians, no living war machines like the Krelth, no energy-forged weapons like the Makabirians themselves. To conquer them would be a formality, a footnote in the annals of Makabirian expansion. But then came the Terror Troop. The first reports were dismissed as battlefield exaggeration, panicked accounts from survivors who had clearly failed in their duty. A single squad of humans had ambushed a Makabirian battalion on Vardos 3, a jungle moon with dense vegetation and treacherous terrain. 8 men against 800. The result? Total annihilation, not for the humans but for the Makabirians. The survivors spoke of shadows that moved faster than sensors could track, of explosions so precise they seemed preordained, and of screams, horrible screams, that echoed long after the battle ended. High Command attributed it to cowardice among their ranks and sent reinforcements to correct the situation. The second encounter was worse. It happened on Corin 5, a barren wasteland under a sky perpetually stained red by its dying sun. This time it wasn't just a battalion, it was an entire division. 10,000 soldiers armed with plasma rifles calibrated for precision, grav tanks capable of leveling cities, and aerial drones programmed for relentless pursuit. They were prepared for anything, or so they thought. The Terror Troop didn't strike from the front or even from the flanks. They came from below. The ground itself betrayed the Makabirians as carefully placed charges erupted beneath their formations, throwing soldiers and vehicles into disarray. Out of the smoke emerged 8 figures clad in black combat armor that seemed to devour light itself. Their movements were impossibly fast, their attacks devastatingly precise. One carried a railgun that punched holes clean through grav tanks as though they were made of paper. Another wielded a flamethrower that turned squads into ash before they could even scream. Yet another used nothing but blades, knives that flashed in arcs too quick to follow as he tore through ranks like a phantom. Makabirian commanders responded with cold efficiency. Orbital bombardments targeted suspected human positions. Chemical agents were deployed to flush them out. Side-trackers attempted to lock onto their neural signatures. None of it worked. The humans were always one step ahead, as if they could see every move before it was made. Within hours, an army that had once been the pride of the Empire was reduced to scattered remnants fleeing blindly through Corin 5's desolation. By now, whispers of the Terror Troop had begun to spread across fleets and colonies alike. Some claimed they were demons from humanity's ancient myths. Others suggested they were experiments gone horribly wrong, monsters forged in secret labs deep within Earth's shadowy governments. But those who knew better understood the truth. They weren't monsters at all. They were men. Men forged by centuries of conflict on Earth. A world so hostile, it had shaped its inhabitants into warriors unlike anything else in the galaxy. Men who thrived on chaos and unpredictability, who turned every disadvantage into an opportunity for victory. Men who fought not for conquest or glory, but because survival demanded it, and who would do whatever it took to win. The Makabirian High Command refused to believe it. They deployed an entire fleet to hunt down these so-called humans, mobilizing over 100,000 soldiers backed by warships bristling with enough firepower to reduce entire planets to ash. It was overkill by any standard, but against humanity, it still wasn't enough. The final confrontation took place on Erythrop 7, a desolate world chosen by the Makabirians for its strategic importance and lack of civilian population. A perfect battlefield where collateral damage would not be an issue. The fleet arrived in orbit with precision timing, deploying troops across every major choke point and blanketing potential escape routes with orbital firepower. They brought psi-trackers calibrated specifically for human neural patterns and EMP fields designed to disable human technology entirely. None of it mattered. The terror troop didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like predators. They lured squads into ambushes using false signals and decoys. They turned Makabirian traps against their creators. They exploited every weakness in their enemies' rigid strategies with brutal efficiency. And when night fell on Althera 7, a night darker than any Makabirian soldier had ever known, they unleashed their most devastating weapon, fear. Makabirian soldiers reported hearing whispers in their comms, taunts spoken in flawless Makabirian dialects but dripping with venomous mockery. Shadows moved where none should have been. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. Entire platoons vanished without a trace overnight, leaving behind only bloodstains and shattered weapons as grim reminders of what lurked in the darkness. By dawn, what remained of the once mighty fleet was retreating. Not because they lacked firepower or resources, but because they lacked something far more critical: resolve. The terror had broken them. And so it was that 8 men, a mere handful of humans, brought an empire to its knees without mercy or hesitation. When asked later how they did it, one member of the terror troop simply grinned beneath his helmet and said, "We're human." They called him Bear, though his real name was Commander Elias Grigorov. The nickname suited him well. He was a mountain of a man, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and a thick, dark beard that seemed to bristle with its own wild energy. His laugh was as loud as a cannon blast, and his humor was sharp enough to draw blood. But beneath the jokes and the easy grin lay something far more dangerous. A mind as cunning as it was brutal, a predator's instinct honed by decades of war. Bear wasn't just a soldier. He was a force of nature. The terror troop followed him without question, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They were legends in their own right. 8 men who had turned the tide of battles and toppled armies. But even among them, Bear stood apart. He wasn't just their leader. He was their anchor, their shield, and their sword. And when the human world army needed someone for the impossible missions, the ones no one else would dare take, they always sent Bear and his men. This time was no different. The mission brief came in through secure channels, delivered by an officer whose face was pale even through the hologram. The colony on Althera 9 had gone dark. What had started as minor unrest among the settlers had spiraled into full-blown chaos. Riots in the streets, entire districts reduced to rubble, and reports of something far worse lurking in the shadows. The Makabirians weren't involved. Not yet, but if humanity didn't get its house in order soon, the vultures would start circling. Pacification mission, they called it, a neat clinical term for what everyone knew would be a bloodbath. Bear listened to the briefing with his usual mix of amusement and impatience, leaning back in his chair with his boots propped up on the table. When it was over, he scratched his beard thoughtfully and glanced at his team. Pacification, he said, rolling the word around like it tasted funny. That's just a fancy way of saying, go clean up someone else's mess, isn't it? The others chuckled softly. They were used to Bear's irreverence by now. It was part of what made him so damn good at what he did. But there was an edge to his voice this time, a note of something darker beneath the humor. "What's our leash?" asked Kessler, the team's demolitions expert. He was a wiry man with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, always ready with a sarcastic comment or an explosive charge. "No leash," Bear replied. "They're giving us full discretion." That got everyone's attention. Full discretion meant one thing: total freedom to do whatever it took to complete the mission. No oversight, no rules, just results. "Sounds like they're desperate," muttered Jax, the team sniper. He was quiet by nature, a man who preferred action to words, but when he spoke, people listened. "They are," Bear said simply. "And they should be." He stood then, towering over the others like some ancient war god come to life. His grin returned, sharp and wolfish. "All right, boys," he said. "Pack your gear and kiss your loved ones goodbye. If you've got any left, we'll still talk to you. We're going to Althera 9? The journey to Althera 9 took 3 days aboard their stealth cruiser, a sleek black vessel designed for speed and silence rather than comfort. The team spent most of that time preparing, checking weapons, running simulations, and trading barbs that ranged from crude to downright obscene. It was their way of staying sharp and staying sane. Bear spent much of the trip in the cockpit, staring out at the endless void of space while nursing a bottle of contraband whiskey. He didn't drink much, just enough to take the edge off, but it was a ritual for him before every mission. A way to remind himself that he was still human beneath all the armor and bravado. When they finally arrived in orbit around Althera 9, the situation on the ground was worse than anyone had anticipated. The colony's capital city, once a bustling hub of trade and industry, was now little more than a smoking ruin. Fires burned unchecked across entire districts. Buildings lay in rubble. Bodies littered the streets like discarded trash. And yet there were still signs of life. Scattered groups of survivors huddling in makeshift shelters, armed gangs patrolling their territories like feral animals, and something else, something that moved in the shadows but never showed itself fully. Bear surveyed the carnage from orbit with an expression that could have been mistaken for boredom if not for the fire burning behind his eyes. "Looks cozy," he said dryly. "Cozy enough for you?" asked Kessler with a smirk. Bear snorted. "I've seen worse." He turned to face his team then, his grin fading into something harder and colder. "Listen up," he said. "This isn't just another ride control op. We're walking into hell down there. Stick together, watch each other's backs, and don't get cocky." He paused for effect before adding with a wicked glint in his eye, "Save that for after we win." The others laughed, a short burst of grim humor, but they understood what he meant. They always did. As they descended toward Althera 9's surface in their drop pod, a sleek black coffin designed for rapid deployment, Bear felt that familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. This wasn't just another mission. It never was, not when you were part of his troop. This was war, their kind of war, and God help anyone who got in their way. The drop pod slammed into the surface of Althera 9 with a bone-rattling thud, embedding itself deep into the cracked pavement of what had once been the colony's central plaza. The hiss of decompression filled the air as the pod's doors blasted outward, and 8 figures emerged into the chaos like wraiths stepping out of the void. They moved with practiced precision, spreading out in a defensive formation, their black combat armor absorbing the flickering light from nearby fires. Bear was the last to step out, his massive frame filling the pod's exit like a living wall. He rolled his shoulders, adjusting the weight of his massive rotary cannon, a weapon so large that no one else on the team could even lift it, let alone wield it with his ease. The cannon whirred softly as he activated it, its barrel spinning in readiness. He took a deep breath, inhaling the acrid stench of burning metal and flesh, and grinned. "Smells like home," he said, his voice carrying over the team's comms with a mix of humor and menace. "Your home must be a dumpster fire," Kessler shot back as he checked his explosives kit. "Remind me never to visit." "Focus," Jax cut in sharply, his sniper rifle already scanning the ruined skyline for threats. His voice was calm, but clipped, as always. Jax didn't waste words when there was killing to be done. Bear chuckled but gave a curt nod. "All right, boys, you know the drill. Recon first. We're not here to make friends. Just find out who's still breathing and figure out what's got this place so spooked." The plaza was eerily quiet save for the crackle of distant flames and the occasional groan of collapsing structures. The team moved like shadows through the rubble, their movements synchronized and silent despite Bear's hulking presence. They passed shattered storefronts and overturned vehicles, their weapons sweeping every corner, every alleyway. The bodies they encountered were mostly colonists, men, women, and children who had been caught in the crossfire or executed outright. Some bore crude gang markings carved into their flesh. Others looked like they'd been torn apart by something far less human. "What the hell happened here?" muttered Rourke, their medic and close-quarter specialist. He knelt beside a corpse, a young woman whose eyes were frozen wide in terror, and shook his head grimly. Not just riots, Bear replied grimly. This is something else, something worse, added Kessler as he pointed to a nearby wall smeared with blood. The crude symbols scrawled across it were unfamiliar, jagged shapes that seemed to twist unnaturally even when viewed head-on. Great, muttered Jax from his perch atop a collapsed building. First gangs, now cultists? This mission just keeps getting better. Stay sharp, Bear ordered. His voice had lost its usual humor now, replaced by a low growl that sent shivers down even his team's spines. Whatever did this might still be here. They pressed on toward what had once been City Hall, a towering structure at the heart of the plaza that now leaned precariously to one side, its upper floors gutted by fire. According to their intel, it had served as both the colony's administrative hub and its primary communications center before everything went to hell. If there were any survivors or any clues about what had caused this disaster, they'd likely be inside. The approach was slow and methodical, every step measured against potential ambushes or traps. But when they reached the building's entrance, a gaping hole torn through reinforced steel, they found no resistance waiting for them. Only silence. Too quiet, muttered Kessler as they stepped inside. The interior was worse than they'd imagined. The walls were scorched black, debris littered every surface, and more bodies lay scattered across the floor in various states of mutilation. But it wasn't just death that filled the air. It was fear, palpable and suffocating. What kind of riot does this? Rourke asked softly as he examined another body, a man whose face had been twisted into an expression of pure horror before death claimed him. Not a riot, Bear replied grimly. He pointed toward one corner where something glinted faintly in the dim light, an alien weapon half buried under rubble. Makabirian tech. Jax confirmed after a quick scan from his perch near a shattered window. The revelation hit them like a punch to the gut. The Makabirians weren't supposed to be here. Not yet. Humanity's fragile truce with their empire was still technically intact, though everyone knew it wouldn't last forever. If Makabirian forces were already moving against Althera 9, looks like we've got company, Bear said darkly. As if on cue, a low rumble echoed through what remained of City Hall, a sound that wasn't mechanical but alive, guttural growls interspersed with clicking noises that made every hair on their necks stand on end. Contacts! Jax barked over comms as he swung his rifle toward movement in the shadows beyond their position. They came fast, too fast for anything human, skittering out from hidden crevices like insects swarming from a hive, creatures that bore only passing resemblance to Makabirian soldiers, but moved on all fours with grotesque speed and agility. Their bodies were twisted amalgamations of flesh and metal. Their eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light, and their mouths, if they could even be called mouths, were filled with jagged teeth that clicked together hungrily as they charged. "Open fire!" Bear roared as he brought his rotary cannon to life. The plaza erupted into chaos as bullets tore through flesh and metal alike. Explosions lit up the darkness like miniature suns, and screams, both human and inhuman, filled what remained of Althera 9's once proud capital. Bear stood at the center of it all like some ancient warlord reborn for an age of steel and fire, laughing even as blood splattered across his armor, shouting orders between bursts from his cannon, daring death itself to come for him if it could muster up enough courage. And behind him stood his team, the terror troop, 8 men against an army again. But this time felt different. This time felt personal. The enemies of humanity were not just savage. They were designed to be nightmares incarnate. The Makabirians had long abandoned any pretense of honor or restraint in their endless conquests. To them, war was not merely a tool of expansion. It was an art form, perfected through centuries of genetic engineering, psychological conditioning, and a philosophy that celebrated cruelty as strength. Their soldiers were bred in vats, stripped of individuality, and reshaped into killing machines whose only purpose was to destroy and dominate. But it wasn't enough to simply kill their enemies. The Makabirians sought to break them first. The creatures that now swarmed Althera 9 were a testament to this philosophy. These were not ordinary Makabirian soldiers. No, these were something far worse. They called them Renborn, though the humans had quickly coined a simpler name, Skinners. The name fit. These monstrosities were grotesque amalgamations of flesh and metal, their bodies twisted into forms that defied nature and reason. Their skin, what little remained of it, was stretched taut over cybernetic implants that jutted out like jagged bones. Their limbs were elongated and clawed, designed for tearing through armor and flesh alike. And their faces were the stuff of nightmares. Eyeless sockets glowing with an eerie bioluminescence, mouths that split open far wider than any jaw should, revealing rows of serrated teeth that clicked together in anticipation. But it wasn't their appearance alone that made them horrifying. It was how they fought. The Skinners didn't just attack, they hunted. They moved with an unnatural speed and coordination that suggested some kind of hive-mind intelligence, darting through shadows and striking from angles no human could predict. They didn't kill cleanly or efficiently. They tore their victims apart piece by piece, savoring every scream, every drop of blood. And when they weren't killing, they were playing, dragging survivors into the darkness to prolong their suffering for hours or even days. Bear had heard the stories before. Entire colonies reduced to ghost towns overnight, their inhabitants slaughtered or worse, left alive but broken beyond repair. Survivors spoke in hushed tones about the Skinners' sadistic games, forcing captives to fight each other for scraps of food, carving messages into their flesh with claws that burned like molten iron, or implanting parasites into their bodies that would slowly consume them from the inside out. These things aren't soldiers, Kessler muttered as he lobbed a grenade into a cluster of advancing Skinners. The explosion lit up the plaza for a brief moment, revealing the creatures' writhing forms as they scattered like cockroaches before regrouping almost instantly. Their freaking nightmares, their tools, Jax corrected from his perch above the battlefield, his sniper rifle picking off targets with clinical precision. Makabirian propaganda made flesh. Fear is half their weapon, and pain's the other half, Rourke added grimly as he slammed his combat knife into the throat of a Skinner that had gotten too close. The creature gurgled and thrashed before collapsing in a heap at his feet. Bear's voice cut through the chaos like a thunderclap. Focus up. They bleed like anything else. Make 'em bleed. He swung his rotary cannon in a wide arc, unleashing a torrent of high-caliber rounds that shredded through several Skinners at once. But for every one that fell, two more seemed to take its place. They came from every direction now, climbing over rubble, bursting out of sewer grates, dropping from rooftops with bone-jarring impacts. They're testing us, Jack said over comms as he took down another Skinner mid-leap. Probing our defenses. Let him probe, Bear growled as he switched to incendiary rounds and fired into a dense cluster of enemies. The resulting inferno lit up the night sky and filled the air with a sickening stench of burning flesh and metal. We'll burn 'em all down. But even as he spoke, Bear knew this was only the beginning. The Skinners weren't acting on their own. They never did. Somewhere nearby, hidden in the ruins or perhaps deep underground, there would be a Makabirian overseer, one of the Empire's elite commanders who controlled these monstrosities like pieces on a chessboard. The overseers were no less monstrous than their creations, though their savagery was tempered by cold intellect rather than raw bloodlust. Unlike the Skinners, who reveled in chaos and carnage, the overseers operated with surgical precision. They studied their enemies meticulously, exploiting every weakness with ruthless efficiency. And when brute force wasn't enough to achieve victory, they turned to psychological warfare, spreading disinformation among enemy ranks, using captured prisoners as bait or human shields, even broadcasting live feeds of tortured captives back to their families. Bear clenched his jaw at the thought. He'd seen what overseers could do during previous campaigns, the atrocities they orchestrated with chilling detachment, and it made his blood boil. Jax, he barked into his comms as he mowed down another wave of Skinners with his cannon. Find me that overseer. Already on it, Jax replied coolly as he scanned the battlefield through his rifle's scope. The rest of the team fought like demons possessed, holding their ground against wave after wave of Skinners despite being outnumbered 20-1. Kessler's grenades turned clusters of enemies into smoldering craters, Rourke's shotgun roared like thunder as he blasted apart anything that got too close. Even Jax occasionally descended from his sniper perch to join the fray with his sidearm when things got too hot. But for all their skill and firepower, Bear knew they couldn't keep this up forever, not without taking out the Overseer first. Clock's ticking, he muttered under his breath as he reloaded his cannon with practiced ease. Because if there was one thing Bear knew about Makabirians and their sadistic creations, it was this: they didn't stop until everything around them was dead, or worse than dead. And humanity? Humanity didn't have time for worse than dead anymore. The battle raged on, a symphony of chaos and destruction that seemed to stretch into eternity. The Skinners came in endless waves, their grotesque forms illuminated by the flickering fires that consumed the ruins of Althera 9. The Terror Troop fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. Every shot, every swing of a blade, every explosion a defiant roar against the overwhelming odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded, but they were human, and that meant they were dangerous. Bear stood at the center of it all like some ancient war god, his rotary cannon roaring as it spat death into the charging hordes. His armor was battered and scorched, his beard matted with blood, some of it his own, but his grin never wavered. He thrived in this chaos, fed off it like a predator in its element. "Keep pushing," he bellowed over the comms, his voice a thunderclap that cut through the cacophony of battle. "We're not dying here today." Kessler laughed as he hurled another grenade into a cluster of Skinners, the explosion sending limbs and shards of metal flying in all directions. "Dying? Hell no. I've got a date next week. I'm not missing that for these ugly bastards. Focus." Jack snapped from his sniper perch, his rifle picking off targets with unerring precision. "We've still got an Overseer to find." "I'm working on it." Bear growled as he fired another burst from his cannon, mowing down a line of Skinners that had been closing in on Rourke. These freaks just don't know when to quit. But even as he said it, he could feel the tide beginning to turn. The Skinners were relentless, yes, but they weren't invincible. They bled like anything else when you hit them hard enough. And the Terror Troop? They hit harder than anyone. "Bear," Jax's voice crackled over the comms, sharp and urgent. "I've got eyes on the Overseer. Northwest quadrant. Inside what's left of that tower." Bear followed Jax's coordinates and spotted the structure. A crumbling spire that jutted out of the rubble like a broken tooth. It was barely standing, its upper floors gutted by fire, but it offered a clear vantage point over the battlefield. "Figures," Bear muttered under his breath. "Cowards hiding while his pets do all the work." "What's the play?" Kessler asked as he reloaded his grenade launcher. "The play," Bear said with a wicked grin, "is we go say hello." The team moved with brutal efficiency, carving a path through the remaining Skinners as they advanced toward the tower. Kessler's grenades cleared out clusters of enemies. Rourke's shotgun roared like thunder at close range. Jax provided covering fire from above, while Bear led the charge with his rotary cannon blazing. By the time they reached the base of the tower, most of the Skinners were either dead or retreating, though whether they were fleeing out of fear or regrouping for another attack was anyone's guess. "Stack up," Bear ordered as they approached the entrance, a jagged hole torn through reinforced steel. The team fell into formation without hesitation, their weapons trained on every possible angle of attack. They moved through the building like ghosts, their footsteps silent despite their heavy armor. The interior was dark and stifling, filled with smoke and the stench of death. But Bear didn't slow down, not until they reached what remained of the tower's top floor. The Overseer was waiting for them. He, or rather it, stood at the far end of the room, framed by shattered windows that offered a view of the burning city below. Like all Makabirian Overseers, it was tall and imposing, its body encased in sleek black armor adorned with glowing red runes. Its face was hidden behind a featureless mask save for two glowing slits where its eyes should have been. "So," Bear said as he stepped forward, his cannon whirring softly in readiness, "you're the one pulling all these strings." The Overseer tilted its head slightly, studying him with an almost curious air before speaking in a voice that was cold and mechanical, yet laced with disdain. "You are human," it said slowly, as if tasting the word for the first time. Primitive creatures driven by emotion and chaos. You should not have survived this long. Bear chuckled darkly. Yeah? Well, we're full of surprises. The overseer raised one clawed hand, and suddenly more skinners emerged from hidden alcoves around them. At least 24, their glowing eyes fixed hungrily on the humans. Kill them, the overseer commanded. But before any of them could move, Kessler fired a grenade directly into their midst. The explosion tore through their ranks with devastating force, scattering bodies and debris across the room. Nice try, Kessler said with a grin as he reloaded. The fight that followed was brutal and chaotic, the kind of close-quarters combat where every second felt like an eternity. The terror troop fought like demons unleashed. Rourke's shotgun roared as he blasted apart anything that got too close. Jax picked off targets with deadly precision, even in such tight quarters. Kessler's grenades turned clusters of enemies into smoldering craters. And Bear was everywhere at once, his cannon shredding through skinners while his fists crushed those foolish enough to get within arm's reach. Within minutes, only one enemy remained, the Overseer itself. It fought with a skill and ferocity that belied its cold demeanor, its claws slicing through steel beams as easily as flesh, its movements impossibly fast for something so large. But it wasn't enough. Not against humans who had spent their entire existence fighting against impossible odds. In the end, it was Bear who delivered the killing blow, a single shot from his cannon that punched clean through its chest plate and sent it crashing to its knees. As sparks erupted from its shattered body and black ichor pooled around it like blood, the Overseer tilted its head upward to look at Bear one last time. These humans, it rasped in a voice filled with both awe and horror. Terrible. I've never met such brutal creatures. Bear leaned down until he was eye level with it and grinned savagely. Yeah? Well, now you know why you shouldn't mess with us. And then he pulled the trigger again, ending it for good. The room fell, silent save for their ragged breathing, as they surveyed what remained of their enemies. Mission accomplished, Jack said quietly over comms. Damn right, Bear replied before turning toward what remained of Althera, 9 outside those shattered windows. A city broken, but not beaten, just like humanity itself. And somewhere deep inside him, beneath all the humor and bravado, he felt something stir. Pride not just in himself or his team, but in what they represented, in what humans represented. Because if there was one thing humanity knew how to do better than anyone else, it was survive, no matter how brutal things got along the way.